This video is going to be about dominant seventh chords. Definitely the strangest name of the seventh chords, but it'll be very easy to build dominant seventh chords because we already know how to make major seventh chords. So this won't take long. Let's dive in and I'll show you how to build dominant seventh chords. Dominant seventh chords. Another 4-note chord, another seventh chord. The last one was a major seventh. The dominant seventh is easy to build once you know how to make a major 7 chord, because all you do is take the major triad and instead of adding the 7th note from the scale, you add the flatted 7th note from the scale. And that's it. The dominant, C dominant, would therefore be C, E, G, and instead of adding the major 7th, which would be B natural, you add the B flat. So it's C, E, G, and B flat. Here's what it sounds like. The symbol for a dominant seventh chord is the root of the chord C, or whatever. It could be D, G, with just the number 7 next to it. So when you see on a chord sheet or a lead sheet a chord letter and then just the number 7 next to it, it's a dominant seventh chord that they want. I think the reason for this is that the dominant seventh is the most common seventh chord you hear. It's used the most, I think, and in order to speed up the writing of the lead sheets and to make it easy to read, since it's the most common, it's kind of like the C major. You don't have to put the M there for the major. You can just put C, and that means C major. Well, you can just put C7, and that means dominant seventh. So if you see any letter like a G with a 7 after it, that's a dominant seventh. The way you make it is, the easy way is to make the major 7 and then drop that 7th note, that last note, a half step. Just flatten it so that it ends up being a whole step below the octave. I won't build them all because all you have to do is go back to the last video on major seventh chords if you're confused how to build them, and just build the major 7 and then drop that last note a half step, and then you'll have the dominant seventh. And that's all there is to dominant seventh chords. They're very common. What's that? Uh-oh. Nerd alert. Nerd alert. I'm going to take a minute and explain for the nerds in the crowd why it's called a dominant seventh. But if you don't care, you don't have to listen to it. It's just a name. You can memorize it, dominant seventh, and just play the major 7 and flat the 7th. So that's all you need to know. You don't have to know why it's called a dominant. But for the nerds out there, and I'm one of them, I always wondered, why is it called a dominant seventh? It sounds pretty weird. In any scale, major scale, the 5th tone is called the dominant tone. And I'm going to work with the C major scale because that's the easiest to see this in. Now, of course, the tonic is the C. That's what it's named after, so that everything is compared to that. So if we're working in a C major scale, all the other notes are compared to C for this purpose. And when we say that the 5th is the dominant tone in that diatonic scale, the 5th is G in the key of C. What the term dominant tone means is that of all the intervals you can play, the 5th is the cleanest. And I'm not just making this up. If you had an oscilloscope, you could see it in the waveform that the sound waves make when you lay the G on top of the C. You'll see that it is the cleanest, the best match. But you can also hear it. If you'll play all the intervals, and for people who like to do this kind of thing, it's good for your ear and it's fun to hear. You'll hear, and I'll try to, I don't know if the camera's microphone is good enough to do this, or the speaker on your computer or whatever, but you might be able to hear it. And if you don't hear it here on the video, go to a piano and play around with it until you hear it. Well, let me show you what these various intervals sound like. Remember, in the C major scale, it's all the white notes. So C is what we're going to compare everything to. So we start out with a C, and then let's compare it to the second, which is a D, right next to it. Here's what they sound like together. And I'm hoping the sound picks that up, that's pretty messy. There's a lot of dissonance there. So let's move on to the next one, the first and the third together. Well, that sounds better. You can still hear some things, but it's a lot better than the last one. Well, let's move on to the first and the fourth together. Whoa, that's a lot better. Can you hear that? It's just like an ocean wave, kind of barely moving. Now let's try the fifth. And if you listen carefully, you'll find that's a little bit better than the fourth. I'll try the fourth again. And here's the fifth. And just to complete it, let's do a sixth up here with A. You're starting to get some dissonance back again. If you listen carefully, you can hear it wobbling. And here's the B. It's a long ways away, but because it's only a semitone away, there's a lot of dissonance still. And then, of course, up at C again is just a unison. Well, for that reason, that is, the fifth is the cleanest of the intervals, and there's a physics reason for that. The fifth has become known as the dominant. Anyway, with this being the dominant tone, as music developed and seventh chords began to be experimented with and added, people noticed that if you built a seventh chord on a G, but still in the key of C, in other words, starting on G, in the key of C, you're going to build a seventh chord starting on G. So that means you can only use white notes, because the key of C only has white notes. So, of course, the G major triad is easy. It's G, B, D, and that works just great, all white notes. If we want to add the seventh note starting from here up, counting up, it ends up being F natural and still a white key. And here's what it sounds like. So that is a dominant, that is starting on, in the key of C, starting on the dominant tone, G, a dominant seventh chord built in that key. And when you look at that relationship, you realize that the dominant seventh built here in this way does not utilize the interval of a half step between the seventh and the octave, but rather it uses a full step, a whole step, 2 half steps. And so that seventh chord built on the dominant tone will use a dominant seventh, which when you start moving it around and playing it in other configurations, ends up being a flatted seventh from the perspective of the tonic. So again, if we're looking at, now we go back to a C7, a C dominant 7, and if we want that same relationship where we play a major and then we play a flatted seventh to get our seventh note, starting on C, we play the C major, here's the seventh and here's the flatted seventh, and it becomes B flat. And so anytime you're playing a chord, a seventh chord, that has that major on the bottom and then a flatted seventh on top, what you're doing is the same pattern that you get when you build a dominant seventh in that same key. And that's why it's called the dominant seventh, because it's built on the dominant tone of that scale. Now, of course, any key you want, you can build a dominant seventh that same way, and you'll get the same result to get that pattern. Okay, nerd alert over. If anybody's still watching, we're only one step away on seventh chords. We only have one more type of seventh chord that I want to go through before we move back to the song She Loves You by the Beatles, because after we finish the next one, which is minor seventh chords, we'll have all the chords we need for that song and we can put it together. See you then.